Today's Air Force is too small, too old, and too worn out. Meanwhile, security demands are ramping up with a resurgent Russia, China as a military peer, continued regional tensions in Southwest and Northeast Asia. The Arctic is being contested, cyber and space as new operational military domains, and the list goes on. You're very familiar with it. The United States is threatened both at the high and the low end of conflict, and to deal with this, because our Air Force is the oldest, smallest, and least ready in its history, dynamics have to change to increase both capability and capacity. Now, I'd like to offer today that part of that solution may come in the form of a light attack aircraft. As our speakers will explain, it all comes down to providing capability and low-cost options in permissive airspace so our most capable aircraft can focus on more advanced threat environments. This approach will help restore readiness while affording operational efficiencies that can be used for additional procurement of badly needed aircraft like the F-35, B-21, and KC-46. And with us today is retired Major General Larry Stutzriem, a career fighter pilot with extensive time in the F-16 and A-10. Along with him is retired Lieutenant Colonel Mike Buck, also a fighter pilot with time in the F-16 and the F-15. And lastly, we're very pleased to have with us Mr. Jim Dunn, who serves as Deputy Director, Plans, Programs, and Requirements at Air Combat Command. Said another way, Jim's the key linchpin in helping build the future of America's combat Air Force. So Jim, thanks very much for taking the time to come up here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to General Stutzriem, and we'll get on with the presentation. When they're finished, we're going to leave plenty of time to engage in dialogue and answer the questions that are on your minds. Okay, over to you, Stutz.
Good morning. Good morning. That's like church. So before we get into light combat aircraft, a direct discussion, let's put it in some context. And I would like to start at the end of the Cold War, where the U.S. Air Force was at a peak of capability in terms of pure competitors. Around 1994, following the fizzling out of the Soviet Union, the new national security strategy emerged: engagement and enlargement. Engagement being the fact or the belief that globalization was going to bring all those bad actors out there into the fold, into the community of nations, and peers would rise no more. Leading up, kind of doing a fast forward, we get to 2001, 9/11, 2003, the takedown of Iraq and the insurgency that follows. And there's still the underlying philosophy that there's no more pure competitors. It's going to be about low-intensity, permissive environments. In the 1990s, of course, we began the big cuts in Air Force inventory. And you can see from the chart from 1989 to today, in terms of fighters and bombers, about a 36% cut in America's Air Force. Of course, along the way, in that understanding that there would be no more peer-to-peer fights, you had things happening like the B-2 being capped at 20 instead of the combat requirement, which was about 80. F-22 canceled at 187 instead of at that time, the requirement, which was reduced, about 749 aircraft. And you had the retirement of the F-117, the retirement of the F-111. Around 2010, of course, internally, to try to better fund within existing TOA modernization, the CAF redux, 246 F-16s and F-15s taken out of action. Fast forward from there to 2013, the Budget Control Act and the sequestration device we all know about. We don't have to go into detail, where modernization was continued to be squeezed, new programs squeezed out. And of course, the F-35 is yet to reach full rate production. How the Air Force arrived at 2018, next slide, please. Is reflected in the 2018 defense strategy, which is a huge departure from a generation of nation building, low-intensity conflict in permissive environments, and that is that the reemergence in terms of the peers that we all know and loved has come back, and that's what the central focus is now, or challenge to U.S. prosperity and security. Now, in response to that, or in parallel with that, is the statement by the Secretary of the Air Force in the 2018 hearings on posture, which you can see here, that as much as 50% of Air Force squadrons are not prepared for the missions they're tasked to do. Readiness is a huge issue. The new strategic context, though, is not we're flowing back to the high-end threat alone. There still be the low-end spectrum to deal with, a blend that the Air Force will be tasked to deal with. Next slide, please. So the effects of, when we get to the next slide, there we go. The effects of this generation of operations we've been in are pretty stark. And as General Deptula alluded to, we've ground down our high-end aircraft. We've also seen, as the Secretary and the Chief of the Air Force have noted, the readiness of air crews to operate in that high-end environment has been atrophied. There's other effects too, that the high tempo, smaller population of aircraft, that high tempo it is an ingredient in the increasing shortage of pilots. And of course, among fighter pilots, that's the biggest chunk, about 1,500 deficit. And we've just not kept pace with what we're seeing the Chinese do in terms of counter space, the Russians, for an example, in hypersonics, and on and on. So the sustained, permissive, low-intensity operations will remain. But the high-end assets, or aircraft, and the capability of the Air Force to fight at that end needs restoration in terms of its readiness. Next slide, please. Okay, the permissive environment of low-intensity operations is not going away. And the forecast is that this could be generations upon generations. We've seen the dissolution of ISIS, but we've also seen it move into Europe. It's incubating, perhaps. We have to get ahead of that. And what's also not going away anytime soon are those things you see listed there. Counterterrorism mission is there. Ungoverned spaces will still be a concern. There is still going to be a need for a healthy amount of counterinsurgency to stabilize those governments that are legitimate, especially our partners in coalitions around the world. And we need to do a better job of building partnership capacity that can contribute air power capability to any future efforts. And the United States is not going to stop in terms of its policy to intervene when national interests are at stake. Just a couple days ago, if you've been watching, in Afghanistan, Farah City in Farah province was basically captured by the Taliban. Air power goes in, and reports are up to 300 Taliban killed in that engagement. But you had a blend, once again, of U.S. air power, fledgling Afghani air power, and their boots on the ground doing that. General Deptula and I were part of what General Bob Elder calls their boots are air power at the start in 2001 and 2002 in Afghanistan. In terms of, we used our U.S. air power to leverage Northern Alliance boots on the ground to rout the Taliban in about 90 days. The Taliban government was removed. We've seen perhaps the most successful operational concepts succeed: Bosnia, Northern Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq, when we've used that template. So it's going to be around for a while. And what I'll do now is summarize by saying that LCA is a superior alternative in terms of servicing that permissive low-intensity conflict spectrum. And we need to reduce what it takes to do that so that we can prepare, the U.S. can prepare for that high-end fight as directed by the defense strategy, and also maintain our hand in that ongoing low-intensity struggle. So I'll turn it over to Mike Buck, who's going to now get into what is that light combat aircraft, what's its developmental path, and what's the history that brings us to this point in 2018.
Thanks, Stutz. Good morning. I didn't have a chance to test this microphone. Can everybody hear me all right in the back there? All right, well, welcome, and thanks for coming out. In 3 combat deployments to the Middle East, my squadron mates and I felt privileged to be part of that mission. The mission was very challenging. The close air support mission, providing precision munitions in support of coalition ground forces with minimum applied violence for maximum effect and 0 collateral damage. We took great pride in doing that and doing it well. The F-16 had the capability to do that mission. We could put bombs in pickle barrels, as they used to say. But it wasn't a perfect airplane for the job. For instance, we could get someplace quickly when the screaming started, but as soon as I arrived, I'd have to send my wingman to a tanker because we were out of gas. And then we'd have to ping pong back and forth. Oh, by the way, having 1 fighter pilot is, well, you're less than half as smart as a 2-ship at that point. So you need that support, and we just couldn't do that. Furthermore, by deployment number 2 and deployment number 3, I began to witness the effects of this ongoing use of F-16s, F-15Es, and so on the aircraft, on the mission readiness, on the pilots, and I wasn't very happy about it, and I asked myself, how long are we going to do this? Because it's having a palpable cost that we can see. And so let me start off by asking a rhetorical question. If we had known 18 years ago that we were going to use 4th and now 5th generation assets to conduct these kinds of missions for 18 years with no end in sight, would we have made that choice? Or would we have instead looked for an alternative path? And perhaps that alternative path is in front of us today in the form of light combat aircraft. Slide, please. So there's plenty of historical precedent for the use of these kinds of aircraft, most recently and most notably in Vietnam. Certain areas in Vietnam that are strategic were well defended by integrated air defenses, Hanoi, Paul Domer Bridge, and so on. But large chunks of the country were not. Effectively no enemy air, very reduced enemy ground threat, sometimes only small arms fire. So the Air Force actually literally went to the boneyard, pulled aircraft out, got them back into flying condition, and employed them with great success over there. Aircraft like the A-1E Skyraider are legendary. Some great stories in that, some great effect. Able to stay on station for long periods of time, pick up individuals on the ground and employ munitions, of which they could carry quite a few. And they were relatively fast, certainly compared with other low-to-the-ground types of air vehicles at the time. And really the same conditions persist in the world today, around the world, to include the Middle East. An aircraft that we're using right now, which really validates what an LCA can be in the modern world, is the U-28, which curiously appears to have no nickname, but is built by Pilatus. And it was, think of it as a single-engine commuter aircraft that the Air Force was able to acquire and put a very sophisticated suite of sensors and communication systems on board, and using great effect in remote locations from austere fields and so on. And what that airplane is able to do with its open mission systems architecture has been astonishing. It's able to act as a communications node between multiple players on the ground and other aircraft in flight, providing situation awareness to both. It's able to, with its open mission systems, be upgraded rapidly. They can try a new piece of software out one day, reject it, improve it the next day, load it in, and it's very responsive to the needs and the ideas that come to mind at the time. The synergies cannot be underrated when you insert this kind of airplane into the process. For an F-16 pilot like me to roll into an area, establish communications, receive a 9-line from the guy on the ground, find the target, validate that it's the target, make an attack run, and assess the battle damage could take 15 or 20 minutes under good conditions. With the U-28 already having done all that work, all I would have to do would be to grab his information and make an attack run. And so it could take 1 to 2 minutes to accomplish the very same thing, which that 18 minutes of not being fired at by guys on the ground, they like that. And, oh, by the way, it means we can conduct multiple attacks in fairly short order. Same thing's true with the U-28's work with the MC-130s. By relieving them of the need to find the target in the first place, again, the rounds start coming down much more rapidly and much more precisely. So looking at the idea of taking these capabilities but putting them into perhaps a more maneuverable, more capable platform is where we talk about the OAX. So not to get into numbers and knots and gallons and things like that, just consider that an OAX, generally speaking, is about 3/4 the size of an F-16. It can carry about 80% of the combat load of an F-16, whether they be unguided or guided precision munitions of the GPS or the laser-guided bomb variety. It has the same kind of sensor suite as an F-16. It is not fast by fast jet standards, but again, much faster than, say, helicopters. It'll fly about 70% of the F-16 speed, but it only takes off with 20% of the F-16's fuel. And yet, miraculously, it doesn't have to go to the tanker. It can stay airborne for as long as 6 hours, depending on how long it takes to get to its AOR. It can remain overhead and keep the heat on and keep the eyes on as other aircraft and other players come in to the fight, and act as a node, communicating situation awareness to the guys on the ground and the aircraft in flight. Slide, please. So this idea got some traction. Last August, they conducted what is now phase 1 of the light attack experiment. 4 aircraft were involved: the A-29 Super Tucano, the AT-6 Wolverine, the Air Tractor Longsword, and the Scorpion jet. And that looked at some fairly significant characteristics to validate what the manufacturers were saying. The ability to operate from short runways, the ability to operate from unimproved airfields, precision and non-precision weapons engagement, and validating again time aloft versus fuel consumption. All those were important things to quantify, and I think they did a good job with that. And we'll talk more about the second phase in just a little bit. Next slide, please. An opportunity has presented itself with the idea of light combat aircraft. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the research and development and acquisition paradigms were quite different than they are today. We had a number of manufacturers, for one thing, which we don't have today, but we had manufacturers who were producing new aircraft every 4 to 5 years. Sometimes they were upgraded versions of previous aircraft, sometimes they were entirely new. Take an F-84 straight wing and put a swept wing on it, and you have a new airplane, much faster airplane. A company like Convair, simply asked to improve the F-102, might go to work and give you an F-106 instead. So that industry research and development was key to keeping the force modern and young and ready. And we can return to that. Instead of taking 20 years to get to a major weapons system, we can turn these aircraft out in 4 to 5 years, even as a developmental option. The OAX is optimized for attack. That's a niche that needs to be filled. Another niche that needs to be filled is ISR. We're currently only supplying about 30% of the requested intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance worldwide. We could optimize a light combat aircraft to provide that sort of ISR to the COCOMs and to the boots on the ground. So following the OAX, one option would be to move to a somewhat developmental option, and that would be a reconnaissance attack aircraft, or RAX. I have a picture of the Scorpion jet up there simply because at present it sort of exemplifies what kind of aircraft we're talking about. Jet-powered aircraft, still not consuming nearly as much fuel as an afterburning F-16 or F-15E, but able to go a little bit faster. This aircraft has a large weapons bay, which is what an RAX would need to be able to change out its sensors, to change in fairly quick time from one mission to another in a simple turn. And this will fill that need rapidly and give us the ability to scale our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance as necessary. And if we can get to this in 4 to 5 years and produce them in sufficient quantities and continue along the model of continuous improvement and development, particularly with open mission systems architecture allowing rapid upgrades and responsive changes to avionics capabilities, then that would be greatly beneficial. Beyond that, other things come to mind. The TX aircraft that's soon to be in the Air Force inventory could, as the F-5 was, modified to be a combat aircraft. So think of that as an ATX. And as much as Stutz loves the A-10, it's not going to fly forever. And someday we'll need an AX-2 program. And if we develop a long-term program of continuous development, this I think will pay off in spades with the revitalization of the attack enterprise and allow the 4th and 5th gen high-end assets to work more on near-peer threats. Next slide, please. With that, I'll turn it back over to General Stutzriem.
Thank you, Alien. So, LCA conceptually will solve the mismatch of this aircraft population at the high end, that high-end mission, in a mismatch with assets that we have. LCA will serve in a number of benefits. So first, just as we started, is relieve the high-end aircraft and the air crews in this point in time to reestablish readiness for that high-end mission. But over a longer period of time, let that stand and let a less expensive, more affordable capability take care of that permissive low-intensity conflict. Of course, the air crews, as I mentioned before, is a big issue, and air crew readiness will always be an issue at the high end, requiring the highest training load, except for close air support pilot. I'll just say that. With the LCA, you also free up operations and maintenance money, and that certainly is within the TOA, dollars that can be spent on priority programs elsewhere. And let me look at the, just draw your attention to this chart. I don't mean to be too sophomoric in this math, but we estimate that the LCA will operate on about $2,000 per hour, flying hour. And you look at the F-16 being 10 times that, 10,000 hours, take a look at the number, you're talking about an F-35. And responding to the rhetorical question you asked, Mike, we're talking perhaps in the last 18 years a total savings of, had we used LCA, of an F-35 squadron. It's a significant savings. There's two other advantages to LCA as we did our study on this, and they're strategic in nature. And the first one is about being a concurrent partner in building partnership capacity that the U.S. Air Force has light combat aircraft, and they're the same capability we're exporting to our partners that can afford it. Chief of Staff of the Air Force has mentioned on multiple occasions that a number of air chiefs have remarked to him that they want to participate, they want to develop air power capabilities and be with him, but they can't afford a fleet of F-16s. Light combat aircraft do that. And it is also blended into the need to have coalition partners that can actually contribute. For those of you who remember a coalition compound down at CENTCOM, a lot of that coalition support was more about obtaining U.S. intelligence information than it was actually providing capability. And all the more so if it can provide air power capability. The second, what I call strategic benefit, has to do with building the U.S. Air Force out of its current pilot deficit. And we're talking in particular about the biggest piece of that, which is the fighter pilot deficit. To get the absorption capacity in the equation of retention, production in AETC, and absorbing new pilots into the fighter squadrons, absorption is the limiting factor. In our fighter squadrons today, they can absorb about 5 new pilots a year. To get not just on a stable course, but to actually fill the deficit back in, the Air Force would have to have about a 40% larger inventory of 4th and 5th generation aircraft to be able to fill that, to have that absorption capability. About 10 squadrons, about 300 light combat aircraft provide the same absorption capacity. But because of the ute rates on these airplanes and the sortie duration, you get to the required 500 hours of flying time in the airframe to become an experienced pilot. So that happens in about half the time. So there's a tremendous utility in putting light combat aircraft into the pilot shortage equation. And stay tuned, on the 7th of June, Mitchell Institute will be rolling out another study on the pilot shortage, which goes into this in more detail. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to Mike to wrap us up, and then we'll be ready for some questions, or for Mr. Dunn, I'm sorry.
I was clear ready to just go at questions.
You can't
So I
hide.
think Stutz has painted a pretty good picture of where we are and how we got here. So now, what's the path forward? Well, right now, the phase 2 of the light attack experiment is taking place. And the A-29 and the AT-6 were selected from phase 1 to continue on into phase 2. And they're evaluating things of a more pragmatic nature, maintenance, sustainability, and even partner interoperability. And we'll have the results of that experiment here fairly soon. But we're moving toward a point where we can start making a decision about acquiring an aircraft. When we do go to acquire an aircraft, it'd be best if it were acquired quickly and without too much process. Fortunately, the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act supplies those tools, new authorities for acquisition. And when we're talking about a product that is essentially off the shelf, unless we simply insist on making multiple significant changes to the airframe, then we should be able to skip multiple lengthy process milestones in the acquisition and perhaps even go straight to production. It might take a paradigm shift to say, let's accept the aircraft as it is, but because we have open mission systems architecture, we can over time make it exactly what we want. Acquiring those aircraft rapidly will also provide an incentive to industry to do that industry research and development and to provide that opportunity for continuous improvement and development. There's no getting away from the reality, though, that additional funds are required. The Air Force needs funds on top of its current total obligation authority to acquire these aircraft, say 300, without robbing from modernization, which is the sine qua non at the moment. We really can't afford to take money out of the very aircraft that the LCA are designed to relieve and designed to set the bed for, if you will. And so we're hoping that with these new realities and acquisitions and awareness of the value of the LCA, that those funds can be found, because the Air Force can't afford to do without those new 5th generation assets. So as I conclude then, let me just modify that rhetorical question from earlier. Knowing what we know now, if we posit that we're looking at another 18 plus years of doing the same kind of mission, should we continue as we are, or should we look at doing something different? Perhaps acquiring light combat aircraft to relieve those assets and to strengthen our fighter force. And now Mr. Dunn, Deputy Director, Plans, Programs, and Requirements, Air Combat Command.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me to join the processions here this morning, General Deptula. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure being here with you. So, from Air Combat Command perspective, General Holmes has been very clear to us. He is 100% behind our efforts in moving forward with a light attack experiment and then moving forward into an acquisition phase. Now, fortunately, the acquisition business isn't my business, and General Bunch would beat me up if I tried to claim any ownership of that. But I'll tell you right now that from our perspective here, the bottom line on this activity was an ability to assess an off-the-shelf product. Take something that was currently available or would be available with only minor modifications, assess its utility for the fight that was described in the National Defense Strategy, because we paid a lot of attention to the directions about the high-end fight, but there was also verbiage in there about the lower-end fight, the counterinsurgency fight, the continuing global war against violent extremist organizations. And what we were charged to do by the Secretary of Defense is to try to find better ways to continue that decades-long fight also. So as we looked at that, we made the assessment that indeed there appears to be an off-the-shelf variant that would have utility for us in there. We've run the first experiment, we're in the second experiment now to further refine our perception, our understanding of the utility, the puts and takes of it, operating constraints, maintenance and logistics, which is a big focus of this current experiment that's going on. And then we will work with senior Air Force leadership to move forward potentially into an acquisition and procurement phase of this aircraft. As you've heard our speakers today talk about, one of the great abilities that we will get here is the ability to absorb additional aviators into the force. I don't know if anybody saw the testimony yesterday from the chief and the secretary, but yesterday they talked about this very item, that we are approaching 2,000 pilots short in the United States Air Force. We're looking for opportunities that we can bring in increased number of aviators, put those aviators in appropriately provisioned aircraft so that 500 hours in the light attack aircraft is meaningful hours in preparation and moving forward to either a 4th gen or a 5th gen airplane, and helping us to claw our way out of the hole that we're currently in on rated aviators that are out there. So one of the great chores from me, from the requirements, is throttling people who want to go in there and change and creep the requirements for these platforms. So we're trying to discipline ourselves, because sometimes we're our own worst enemies, to make sure that we constrain the nice to haves and look solely at the must haves so that we can completely evaluate whether or not an off-the-shelf product is suitable for us, and then to move rapidly through using the new acquisition authorities that the Air Force has been granted to actually procure and field those aircraft. So I appreciate your time this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, to get the audience warm, I've got a couple of starter questions, if you will, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And the first one for you, Jim. As we all know, over the past several years, actually since 2001, remotely piloted aircraft have grown exponentially in their combat utility, fundamentally redefining what it means to project power in permissive airspace. Both Stutz and I were there at the KAOC for the first combat use of a weapon off of a Predator. And given that these aircraft have matured in terms of what they can do, I guess one of the questions out there is, why didn't the Air Force consider the MQ-9 for participation in the light attack experiment along with the other aircraft that were shown up there?
Thanks for the question. So in reality, we kind of did. I mean, before we got to the point where we were actually looking for individual companies to come in with their specific offering to participate in the first line of experience, in that first run-up, we evaluated the utility of the RPA fleet. And there's no doubt that both the MQ-1, the MQ-9, and their capabilities really have changed the way that we conduct the fights that we're doing today and that we'll do in the future. But there's a key attribute there that didn't scratch one of the itches that we need to get after, which is the ability to accept additional pilots coming out of a UPT pipeline or WIZOs coming out of that pipeline, to give them an opportunity to fly in an aircraft that was suitable to replicate the type of environment that they would experience when they moved into a 4th or 5th generation follow-on platform. The other thing that really got to us as we were going through there was that we had looked at the light attack previously, a decade, maybe 12 years ago. We looked at a similar program. The difference between that look and what we're doing today was something that one of the other speakers brought up, which is the potential that we will get increased TOA in order to do this. Back 10 years ago, when we first looked at light attack applications in light attack and armed reconnaissance mission area, The idea that we would have to sell off one of our 4th or 5th generation platforms in order to buy this capability in the light attack didn't make sense to us. As we did the business case analysis, it didn't make any sense for us to do that way. Now, with the potential of increased tow available, this becomes much more attractive to us. It gives us a platform that can help us absorb and experience aviators into the CAF so that we can fill the bathtub of nearly 2,000 pilots we're currently short in the Air Force. It gives us an ability, as we move those through and experience those aviators, and use the light attack to relieve some of the stress that the existing force is under, so that aviators and maintainers that are attached to the 4th and 5th generation platforms, they have some greater white space in order to reconnect with their families, do their professional development, participate in the exercises that build the capacity for the high-end fight force. So it was probably that element of absorbing the pilots that really tipped the scale about not including RPAs into this round of experiment and development.
Hey, thanks very much, Jim. Which is kind of, you hit a couple of points that I want to follow up in the question to Mike about in the context of, there are several people out there that question the LCA's ability to truly absorb and season pilots to prepare them to fly the advanced aircraft that are coming down the pike. There's an enormous difference between an OAX ConOps or an F-22 ConOp. So could you talk a little bit about that difference and what your perspective is, being someone who's flown a variety of different kind of airplanes?
You bet. It's actually a pretty exciting possibility to absorb would-be eventual fighter pilots, 4th gen, 5th gen platform pilots. Because of advanced technology, we can make these airplanes do almost anything we want them to do in terms of training. In my logbook, I've got about 250 hours of combat time, which was mostly level flight or turning in circles. And that's a little over a year's worth of training time, typically, stateside. And that 250 hours did not come anywhere close to keeping me proficient. In our squadron, we were fortunate to only have 1 or 2 inexperienced pilots at any given time. And even so, after returning from overseas, we would have to do a dedicated blocking and tackling buildup to get back to a multi-mission, multi-role capability, level of proficiency that we were looking for. So we certainly could do this incorrectly. Even though, as you'll see in the paper, we can produce the needed fighter pilots at an experience level of 500 hours in half the time and in twice the number, unless we had a carefully thought out continuation training syllabus, that could be wasted time. But if that syllabus is carefully constructed, consider that the things that an F-15, F-16, F-35, F-22 pilot, the things that they do in their normal training regimen, this airplane could do it as well, just in a different scale. With open mission systems architecture, we could find people out there who could turn the multifunction displays of an OAX into a simulated radar, simulated warning receiver, and instead of an 80-mile setup, you could begin with a 20-mile setup. And you could work your way into a fight. With live virtual constructive training, you might only have 2 actual adversaries for your training, but wind up using a radar to employ missiles, BVR, and then merge with those 1 or 2 aircraft. The visual maneuvering that takes place is all about line of sight rate, anticipation of what the enemy is doing to get to the point where you're not having to think, but you are instead reacting and projecting and thinking ahead. All of that can be done at these lower speeds. Everything simply scales up later on. It'd be done a lot more efficiently. And one more thing that's important to understand, which is not readily apparent. Typically, if a pilot is able to reach an experience level, he often, by the time he moves on to his next assignment, has not reached the level of instructor pilot. That's a very important person to have, instructor pilots in your cadre. And if we can get to 500 hours in 15 months instead of 32 months, then we can make an instructor pilot out of that recently experienced pilot. And now he becomes a key player in addressing that fighter pilot shortage as well.
Thanks, Monk. I think it's important that you bring on board the fact that, you know, it's no longer just the aircraft or the platform, it's also the avionics piece. And having flown both the AT-6 and the A-29, they both have means to project different environments than, you know, the one that we typically think about in that context. Okay, last one for Stutz, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Stutz, you transition over your career from the F-16 to the A-10. F-16 is a multi-role aircraft. The A-10 is a very specific aircraft. Could you comment on the ability of LAS to perform either a very, very specific mission or open up to others? You know, is this a matter of technology, or is it all about pilot proficiency? You know, we used to talk about the F-16 can perform a variety of different, you know, it can be a 60-40 airplane, but can you have a 60-40 pilot?
Yeah. Well, it comes back to this discussion of, you know, age-old discussion in the 70s, 1980s, 1990s. You know, we wanted, the theme of multi-role was very important. We wanted to limit mission-specific aircraft and pilots to have that flexibility. You know, an F-16 can flex, and we've seen, General Deptula and I have seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, F-16 pilots who are master close air support managers and operators. So what's changed, though, is the share of the ongoing low intensity, that share of the pie, that we'll continue to be doing this permissive environment, low intensity piece. As an anecdote, you know, from my life experience, and they didn't throw me out of the F-16 to go to the A-10. I was an average pilot. But when I got into the A-10, it wasn't until I lived with fighter pilots who do that for a living full time. Very few A-10 pilots flow out into other aircraft. They stay in that. In fact, coming from the F-16, I thought it was an undisciplined bunch of ragtag guys for about 3 or 4 months, until I realized that they're trained at such a superior level to operate in that environment. Plus, they become very close to the other services and understanding what their mission does. In fact, it's one of the few touch points next to our battlefield airmen, perhaps, but in our fighter pilots, of really being close and understanding how to integrate air power in a very powerful way to join the fight on the ground. So that multi-role, single role, you have to really understand how difficult that is. And these light combat aircraft aviators are going to become very good in that. And what Mike said, yes, they can continue to do at a certain level continuation training that allows them to keep a fundamental skill set that will have to be sharpened once they go on to a 4th or 5th generation aircraft, yes. But they're going to have quite a foundation to be able to get to the experience level and the 100 hours that's required when you change MDSs. It's not just required, it's what experience has shown us is necessary to season a pilot to an experience level if they go from aircraft type to aircraft type. It's a mistake to think, I believe, that you equate the first assignment instructor pilot to an LCA pilot. That is not right. Our first assignment instructor pilots are purely training instructors. They're teaching people, men and women, to fly. They're not doing tactics. They're not interfacing with coalition partners. They're not working face-to-face with Army coordinators. So it does take time for a first assignment IP to come up to speed in a new MDS. LCA will be much different for that pilot to go over to 4th or 5th generation aircraft. So I'd say, General Deptula, yes. The LCA pilots will be, so to speak, fungible in terms of their skill sets in moving to another aircraft to become multi-mission fighter pilots from what they're at. We believe, Mike and I, that we're going to see a lot of innovation by young pilots in LCA. And I wouldn't be surprised if very shortly they're offering themselves up to do more than we initially expect them to do. Now, Jim Dunn is probably going to push back at that a little bit when they come forward and say we want to put, you know, heaters and long-range missiles on the LCA, but they're going to come and ask for that. Just expect that innovation to be there with the LCA.
Well, we just modify the software, make them think that they're launching a missile. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with Q&A. Yes, sir. Hold on. And if you would, as Nikki's bringing the microphone over, please state your name, organization, and then go with your question.
Hi, I'm Pat Host with Janes. I have a question for Mr. Dunn. If you do procure aircraft out of this, will you only consider the 2 aircraft participating in the experiment, or will you be open to other companies and products?
Well, we've been very clear that the experiment we're conducting right now isn't some type of disguised competition. It's an ability for us all to learn about the attributes of this class of aircraft. So I would have to defer to General Bunch and the AQ community on what the acquisition strategy would be once we've completed this latest round of experiments and we get a final decision to move forward. But I'll tell you right now that from the market survey that we had accomplished, these 2 guys came to the top. So I'm not saying there's a door closed. It would be inappropriate for me to do that because I'm not in AQ. But it's obvious that these 2 competitors were a product of us looking across and doing a market survey to see who could bring capabilities that would be suitable for our consideration.
Do they have to be in production right now, or can they be like in design? They basically have to be ready to fly.
So the follow-up on this is that one of the key attributes we were looking for was a non-developmental product, and the timeline that we desire to move forward on would be difficult for somebody who did not have a production line going to meet.
Good morning, I'm Tom Risen with Aerospace America. You mentioned that the light attack aircraft could ideally be produced in 4 to 5 years compared to a modern weapons system that took 2 decades. A major part of the F-35 has been electronic warfare and its digital assets. Do you think that light attack aircraft can be built in that time frame, 4 to 5 years, while still having the minimal amount of electronic warfare and digital assets? And what do you think that minimum capacity would be, considering you're looking for a lighter aircraft?
Was that aimed at one of us specifically?
No, whoever.
Okay, I'll give it a try. First of all, remember LCA is going to be in the permissive low-intensity environment, so we're not talking about doing the government-funded R&D to get a superbly high-end suite in that aircraft. And to get it in 5 years, we're going to be also looking, I would assume, and I won't speak for Mr. Dunn here, but at off-the-shelf capabilities, even as it goes through modification cycles. So does that get to your point out?
And if I may add, I may have inadvertently misspoke, but the 4 to 5 year cycle that we're looking at is a continuous improvement, continuous development cycle, which would allow for some development, such as an RAX or an ATX or an AX2. I would expect that if the word were given and the funds were available, that an OAX could be acquired much more rapidly than 5 years.
Are there any minimal capacities that you think, like what minimum digital assets should it have that for this environment?
I'm not quite sure I heard the first part.
What would be the minimum digital capabilities that we need in this environment?
So there's a list of capabilities that were available for the offerers in phase 1 and phase 2 of the experiment. And I would refer you to that list in order to have an idea of what we were looking at in order to make the determination of suitability for our use.
Okay, thanks, Valerie.
Valerie Zinno with Defense News. I've got a question for Mr. Dunn. When these gentlemen next to you talk about basically reestablishing an attack aircraft fleet, you know, not only with an OAX, but an RAX, an ATX, and AX2. Is that something that ACC is studying? Is that the path that it sees itself going down? And should we expect more experiments in this line or more market research within the next year or so?
So, Air Combat Command values the role that the Mitchell Institute, AFA, and our authors of papers like this have, which is basically bringing ideas to the fold. It shouldn't be confused with real programs that the command is moving out on right now, but a good idea is a good idea. And General Holmes clearly supports the idea of moving forward with light attack. He's been on record talking about his also interest in a light ISR platform that's out there. We understand in the National Defense Strategy about that, the direction that we're given to still maintain the ability to react and act in support of our partners and the joint force in this lower intensity conflict zone. So I don't think there's anything that's off the table we will continue to look at, but right now we have no programs of record that are doing this. So first step here is for us to continue the light attack experiment phase 2. At the end of that, we'll analyze the results we've got, which are in this phase really focused on supportability, sustainability, logistics attributes, as well as some cleanup on the operations side. But at that point, we would then make a recommendation to the chief and the secretary, and AQ would establish a strategy. And if we were successful on this, nothing breeds, imitators like success. So I would not be surprised to see another round beyond that.
Mr. Durrani?
Blaise Durrani, got a question because I was there when JPATS was being done. In JPATS, the exact same words were being used for JPATS that we're hearing in the LCA. And JPATS ended up to be a massive development program, and the problems we've had with JPATS all came from the after development, not from the initial aircraft. What are you doing to take the lessons learned from that and making sure we don't end up with a massive program to do, I don't know. I know you don't say you don't have the requirements, you want something off the shelf. JPATS was off the shelf. This will be off the shelf, but we're never satisfied. What actions are taken to prevent another JPATS?
Just for the audience, JPATS, Joint Primary Aircraft Training System.
So, one of it is the discipline that we're trying to make sure we hold to through this process to make sure that we don't allow requirements to creep. Then when we get beyond that, there's no doubt that if we make a decision to go forward with an acquisition strategy and a fielding of this, that once this platform or any platform is fielded and gets in the hands of the airmen that are out there, they're going to come up with new and novel ideas on the things they could do if only. The balance for us will be within the TOA that we have, what are you going to prioritize and what are you going to fund? I guarantee you, because I've had guys send me notes already about their sweet idea to put a widget on this. And we're trying to make sure that we get through with the core of evaluating as close as possible an off-the-shelf product. And once that product gets in, and if we become a program of record, then we have a well-understood modernization and sustainment system that will help us separate wheat from chaff. But that's one of the things that I deal with day in and day out, whether it's on a new program that's still being under evaluation or it's an old program, and my friends from the B-52 days are asking for us to continue to modify their aircraft. So I think we have, if we can constrain the requirements creep so that we can actually make a determination whether or not we are going to require and field a program of record, then we have the processes internally to constrain the modification of that commensurate with how much of the TOA we have to put against that mission set.
Critics of the program have expressed concern about the vulnerability of this aircraft and that it really can't be used because of danger to the pilots. Can you talk about real-world situations right now where this would make sense to be used?
Name an organization.
Oh, I'm sorry, Greg McCarthy, Paltate.
All right, so once again, you know, there are countries that are flying variations of this class of aircraft today, executing the roles and missions that their nations have for them to do. So whether it's Afghanistan or other countries that are out there, there is a place for this class of aircraft. Within the United States Air Force, our special operators, our AFSOC guys, are flying aircraft very similar to this class of aircraft. So we are evaluating the potential vulnerabilities of the aircraft. We've discussed some ways that we would mitigate some of those vulnerabilities. But a key of this is that in the environment that we seek to use it at, when this platform is paired with the technology that the vendors are bringing forward and the weapons standoff range that we're able to achieve with the weapons that we have today, we think that we have an appropriate balance here. Unlike the A-1, these guys don't have to get close enough to see the whites of their eyes. With an LGB or a laser-guided rocket, you can have sufficient standoff range to mitigate the threats. Now, will they be invulnerable? No, but neither is F-22 if he's in the wrong part of the envelope and in the wrong environment.
Okay, one more question. Steve Burke.
This question is for you, Jim. You spoke about nothing
How come you
breeds
guys are
imitators
picking on
like.
me?
Pardon me?
How come you guys are picking on me?
I like it.
You said nothing breeds imitators like success, and General Holmes is on record saying one of his primary priorities is to get to the future faster. So these authorities with rapid prototyping, experimentation, and yielding potentially a rapid acquisition, in your mind, are they limited to just light combat aircraft, or could they even be applied for future penetrating counter-air or other platforms?
General Holmes wants us to find a way to do everything faster. And this is our first step on this, so we have high confidence that if given the right resources here and the seniors' decisions, when they make a decision, that we'll be able to promptly move out and shorten an acquisition cycle. We would also like to use the lessons we learned for that to go after perhaps more complicated systems. And part of that is also, you heard in the testimony yesterday, there's a number of prototyping programs that the Air Force is engaged in. And I think the number was 8, but you'll have to check the Secretary's testimony to be sure. But between those 8 programs where we hope to move forward through prototyping and decisions off of prototyping into production, we expect to shorten those development and acquisition programs by 25 years.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much, gentlemen. We appreciate your insights. And I'm sure they've got a couple minutes to take some of your questions that we weren't able to get here in the audience, or in the time allotted. So I have a small token of appreciation for each of you. This is the 100th anniversary of the cessation of the First Great War. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be the last one. And what you're doing is looking to prepare us to prevent that and or succeed if we have to fight it. So please join me all in thanking our panelists.